statistical models that were created by Neil Ferguson to predict the likely spread of COVID-19 in the UK were hugely influential. In the early days of the pandemic, Neil was on the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, SAGE, presenting scientific evidence to the government and giving regular media interviews on BBC Radio 4 and other media outlets. This was when he became known to many of us as Professor Lockdown. In the next half hour, I want to find out how Neil, a physicist by training, came to be in this position, and 6 months into the pandemic and with winter approaching, what he makes of it all now. Neil Ferguson from Imperial College London, welcome to the Life Scientific.
Thank you, it's good to be here.
I do think that in many people's minds, Neil Ferguson, you are Professor Lockdown. How do you feel about that?
I have to say I don't particularly like the moniker. It may seem like I was the kind of creator of this policy. I was actually it took me quite a while to be persuaded that that was what we had to do. And I was always very conscious of what impact it would have on the society and the economy. So I have never been a complete enthusiast for the idea of locking down society. It was a last resort, really.
What did you think we should do back then?
I think early on we were looking at a whole range of measures, but particularly whether we could, keep the health system intact, at least, without going to the extent that China did. China really set the model for this.
Were you then surprised in March when the government did announce a strict lockdown?
I think by that stage I wasn't surprised. It had become inevitable. I should clarify that what we did is model, social distancing at certain levels, and you quantify that, 75% reduction in contacts. We were never involved in formulating the precise rules which were then imposed, which became known as lockdown.
Because, you were proposing things like, school closures and social distancing.
People working from home, those sort of the sort of measures which we basically had in place until a few weeks ago, and the sort of measures which other countries, not all countries have been homogenous across even Europe.
But did you think, the strict following countries like France and Italy, don't leave the house unless you need to go shopping, 1 hour exercise a day. Did you think that was an overreaction at the time?
I think we got very close, particularly in London, but in some other areas of the country, to hospitals being overwhelmed. And so I think by the time we reacted, yes, I think the strict lockdown was necessary. OK,
Neil Ferguson, let's find out how you got where you are today. You grew up in a remote Welsh hillside.
I did. I was actually born in a remote hillside in the Lake District, but quite early in my life, aged 2 or so, my parents moved to mid Wales, Powys, and bought a very remote, rundown farmhouse. This is in the early 70s. I went to the local half Welsh-speaking primary school, very small school, less than 100 children, and then later to Llanidloes High School, again a small half Welsh school, 500 pupils or so.
And your father was an educational psychologist. Did that have a bearing on your early education?
He experimented a little on us. I don't think he would mind. He'll be listening to this. I don't think he would mind me saying it. My sister and I learned to read very early, well before we went to school, also mathematics. He was a big computer nut back in the day before anybody had computers, and so I got very introduced to microcomputers very early in life. And so we didn't have a television either. We didn't believe in television for children.
Oh, goodness me.
So we had a lot of books around. My mum was a librarian.
So you didn't have a television, but you did have a personal computer. And you were coding, weren't you? So it's not just using it to play games. You were actually writing.
You didn't have any games. The only way to get it to do anything was to code. And so, yes, I coded in it, and then later got the very famous BBC Micro, which was much more capable and had colour graphics, and went from there. And that really, I always liked maths, but I think it was learning to code which really taught me focus and kind of an ability to concentrate on work and pushed my maths on.
Well, of course, you work now as an epidemiologist, but you actually studied physics at Oxford, and you went on to do a PhD there in a highly theoretical and obscure corner of string theory, the fundamental building blocks of the universe. That's...
Yes, and it was an obscure corner of string theory even then. This was before what's now called M theory came about.
Right.
I was actually working on something called bosonic string theory, and it really was the theory of surfaces.
So it's really more maths than physics.
Yes, it was a blend. I spent the first year and a half, rather struggling to prove and failing to prove a hypothesized theorem, and then moved more computationally to more kind of statistical mechanics, which suited me more. I mean, it's still quite mathematical, but I was sitting in front of a computer a lot of the time as well.
And why then the change from physics to epidemiology?
Well, first of all, I think my DPhil taught me I was never going to be the next Ed Witten or, leading theoretical physicist. I was able to follow the papers, and I might have done something in the area, but my brain just wasn't wired at the kind of highly abstract pure mathematics level I once hoped it was. And so I was looking for something a bit more applied, and also wanted to do something which I thought would benefit the world maybe a little more rapidly than string theory would. And so it was just random chance. Mentor of mine, a very famous scientist, Lord Robert May, was at Oxford at the time in zoology, and he was a physicist who had become a biologist and then later did a lot of work on infectious diseases. And I saw him give a talk on the AIDS epidemic, and it was the first time I saw how what I did could be used potentially to study epidemics.
So you moved from modelling subatomic particles to modelling viruses. Was that a steep learning curve?
Yes. I mean, I hadn't done biology A-level. My biology was fairly sketchy, and I rather got dumped in the deep end. I spent 6 months initially modelling measles vaccination strategies for the Department of Health, but then dived into modelling BSE, which was the first kind of new disease which had just been discovered that I worked on. Variant CJD, the human form of mad cow disease, was a real potential threat. Back in 1994-95.
But of course, here we are, two physicists talking.
Yeah.
Biology is complicated. It's messy. How do you sort of assimilate all that? I find it hard when I'm talking to biologists.
So one thing one has to realise about modelling biological systems, because compared with physical or engineering systems, is the models are much greater simplifications of reality. You you do this in all modelling, but even to a much greater degree, you abstract out the complexity. You try to pick the elements of the system which you think are important. So I had a very good mentor, Roy Anderson, and actually a very good set of people in the Oxford group at the time who were kind of world leaders at that and really defined the field. And you pick up these things quickly. I think the thing which changed once I and colleagues like Crystal Donnelly joined the field, and the field was changing quickly anyhow, was computers became more and more powerful and allowed you to actually statistically rigorously test models. You could actually fit these complicated models of biological systems to data. Previously, that had been much harder to do.
You mentioned BSE. In 2001, there was another crisis in British agriculture, foot-and-mouth disease in livestock. 6 million cows and sheep were slaughtered to try and contain the outbreak. You also got involved in modelling that disease?
Yes, very early on. We had already done some modelling of foot-and-mouth disease the previous year in the group, and we took an early interest, therefore, in the first outbreak in the UK in many years.
And was this your first taste of advising government?
No, I'd done some before with BSE, but it was certainly on a much faster timescale and with much higher stakes than back then. I mean, yes, you're directly feeding into the cabinet in number 10 in a way which yes, is quite humbling and scary at times.
Did you enjoy it, if enjoy is the right word to use here?
Yeah, I'm not sure if enjoy is the right word. There are aspects which are enjoyable and, if you're honest, exciting. It's also very exhausting. I mean, you're typically in those circumstances working 18, 20-hour days. It's kind of relentless. And there is always a trade-off between, well, where do you call a halt? If you're trying to get the best numbers out, but they're time critical, you can never do what you would do if you had 6 months to do the work. And so there is that very acute trade-off of trying to get it right enough that you're going to benefit policy making, whilst knowing you can never do a perfect job.
Well, of course, BSE and foot-and-mouth are infectious diseases spread among animals. What was the first human pandemic you studied?
It wasn't so much a pandemic, but after 2001 and foot and mouth, first of all, I started working on so-called bioterrorist threats after 9/11. But then very quickly, SARS came along, basically, which is a precursor you can think of the COVID epidemic. It was the COVID pandemic, which didn't happen, thankfully. So there was a real sense that we were on a knife edge for some weeks. And so it was contained, but only just.
And then, of course, in 2009, along came swine flu pandemic, which you also worked on.
Absolutely, yes. I'd been working